There are things the desert never lets you forget. The smell of burnt sand, the taste of dust on your tongue, and the faces, especially the ones you trusted. I was 26 when the war wrote its name across my bones. The desert doesn't just test your endurance, it strips you to your core until all that's left is what you really are. Some men find courage there, others find ghosts. We were stationed in a province whose name most Americans can't pronounce, but whose valleys swallowed more soldiers than any battlefield on the evening news. I'd been there long enough to stop counting months, long enough for the war to stop feeling like a story and start feeling like gravity. That was when I met Rashid. He walked into our base one morning with a sun-bleached scarf and a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Interpreter," he said, pointing to himself. "I speak your English." His accent wrapped the words like silk over steel. At first I didn't think much of him. We had interpreters before, some good, some gone by sunset, but Rashid was different. He didn't just translate words, he translated worlds. He could sit with an elder and somehow make the man laugh in a war zone. He knew when to soften a tone, when to turn a question into a compliment. In a place where a wrong word could get you killed, Rashid made language feel like a weapon we could trust. He wasn't tall, but he carried himself like someone who'd been watching the desert his whole life and finally understood it. When he smiled, even the most suspicious villager seemed to unclench. The guys liked him, especially Morales, our engineer. Rashid taught him how to curse in Dari, and soon Morales was using the words like punctuation. The camp started to feel lighter. One night after patrol, we sat around a dented lantern. The desert air was cool and dry, the stars sharp enough to cut. Rashid was telling us about his family, 2 daughters, a wife who made bread so good even the Taliban would surrender for a bite, he joked. Someone asked why he risked his life working for Americans. He paused, eyes on the fire. "Because one day," he said softly, "my daughters will ask what I did when monsters came to our home. I want them to know I fought them, even if I used your language to do it." That silenced the camp. Even Sergeant Owens, the kind of man who thought feelings were a luxury, gave a small nod. After that, Rashid wasn't just a translator, he was one of us. Weeks later, he saved our lives. We were escorting a supply convoy through a stretch of road littered with rocks. The afternoon sun had turned everything into a haze. Suddenly Rashid shouted, pointing to a pile of stones arranged just a little too neatly by the roadside. We halted. Turned out there was a pressure plate under the sand, an IED waiting for us. If he hadn't noticed, we'd have been vapor. From that day, we trusted him completely. He became Rash, like one of the boys. He helped hand out rations to kids, traded stories, even joined in when Morales strummed his broken guitar. But there were moments, small ones, that I only recognize now in hindsight. Sometimes I'd catch Rashid staring too long at our convoy maps, or at the black case that held our radio equipment. Once I found him near the comms tent, claiming he was helping clean up. I thought nothing of it. Why would I? He was family. Looking back, maybe the desert was trying to warn me. But trust blinds more than sunlight ever could. The heat that day was the kind that melted time. You couldn't tell where the horizon ended and the mirage began. Even the flies seemed too tired to buzz. We were scheduled for a routine sweep, nothing fancy, just a supply escort through the Karzak Pass. The kind of narrow road that snakes between cliffs like a scar. The kind that looks calm until it is. Same drill, Sergeant Owens barked, adjusting his vest. Morales rolled his eyes. "Nothing's ever routine here, Sarge." We laughed because humor was cheaper than fear. Rashid walked beside me, humming softly under his breath, a tune I'd heard before. I asked him once what it was. "My father's song," he'd said. "It keeps the fear away." That day, though, something in his voice felt off. The melody was slower, uncertain, like he'd forgotten the words halfway through. As we moved deeper into the pass, the radio crackled static, then silence. Signals weak, morales muttered, tapping the receiver. I frowned. It had worked fine earlier. The wind died too. The whole desert seemed to hold its breath. I remember thinking, too quiet. Every soldier knows that kind of silence. It's the kind that listens back. I turned toward Rashid. He wasn't there. "Rashid," I called. No answer. Just the soft hiss of sand shifting under boots somewhere ahead. Then, a sound like thunder trapped in a box. The blast tore through the air, throwing me backward. My helmet cracked against stone, and for a second the world dissolved into ringing and dust. I tasted blood. Saw fire licking at the sky. Men shouting. Someone screaming for a medic. "Ambush!" Owens roared. Bullets rattled the rocks, sharp and metallic, echoing in waves. We scrambled for cover, firing blindly into the ridges. Shadows flickered on the cliffs, figures darting like ghosts. "Where's Rashid?" Morales shouted, pressing a hand to his bleeding arm. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Somewhere inside the smoke and chaos, I thought I saw him. Just a flash, his scarf trailing as he ran uphill away from us. For a heartbeat, I told myself he was fetching help. But the look on his face, it wasn't panic, it was purpose. The firefight lasted minutes that felt like hours. When it finally went still, the desert stank of gunpowder and fear. We'd lost 2 men. 3 more wounded. Owens was limping, cursing between breaths. I stumbled toward the ridge where I'd seen Rashid vanish. Tracks, footprints leading east, away from the ambush site. Too straight, too calm. Not a man fleeing for life, but one walking toward something planned. Later, when reinforcements arrived, we swept the area. We found the enemy's lookout point. Empty now except for a radio, our frequency still tuned in. And a folded map. Ours. It had our convoy route marked in red. Marked and sold. Command was quick to confirm what I already knew in my gut. Rashid was gone. No body, no trace, just the desert swallowing him whole. That night the survivors sat in silence. No laughter, no morale's guitar. Just the crackle of a dying fire and the hollow space where Rashid used to sit. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him looking back one last time before disappearing behind the rocks. And I kept asking myself, when did he decide? When did my friend become a ghost? $200. That's what the intel later said he took for it. $200 for routes times personnel. I'd seen men sell their souls for less, but it didn't make it hurt less. He didn't just sell information. He sold the bond we built, the laughter, the nights under the stars, the firelight promises. I kept thinking of the song he used to hum. My father's song, he'd said. But now I wondered, had it ever been a song to keep fear away? Or was it a lullaby he sang to quiet his conscience? For weeks after, I carried his betrayal like a stone in my chest. We replaced him with another interpreter, a quiet kid who avoided eye contact. None of us trusted him, not really. You can't build bridges on broken bones. But what none of us said, what we couldn't admit, was that we missed him. Even after everything. Because Rashid had made the desert feel a little less lonely. And now that he was gone, it felt endless again. At dusk, I stood at the edge of camp, watching the sun bleed out over the horizon. The air smelled of metal and dust. Somewhere beyond those ridges, Rashid was out there, alive, breathing, maybe even laughing. I told myself if I ever saw him again, I'd ask why. But deep down, I knew I didn't want the answer. The desert already knew. The morning after the ambush, the desert was still smoking. Charred tire tracks, twisted metal, scorched sand. It smelled like burnt oil and iron, like something sacred had been ruined. We buried what we could that day. There wasn't much left to bury. Private Lewis was 21. He'd just gotten a letter from home, a photo of his newborn daughter. I found it in his vest pocket, half burnt but still clear enough to see the baby's smile. He'd been talking about numbing her hope. Hoping. I couldn't say the word without tasting ashes. Sergeant Owen stood beside me as we covered the last grave with stones. $200 damn dollars, he muttered, shaking his head. You believe that? I didn't answer, because believing it meant accepting it. When the sun set, the wind picked up again, gentle at first, then sharp, carrying the ghosts of the firefight with it. It hissed through the rocks like whispers. You could almost hear the desert talking if you listened long enough. That night, command pulled us back to Forward Operating Base Hinson. Debriefing, investigations, reports that turned men into paragraphs. We told the same story over and over until it stopped sounding like ours. Each retelling stripped it of color, of pain, of the sweat and blood. Until finally it was just unit ambushed at Karzak Pass, interpreter missing in action, 3 KIA, 4 wounded. That's how the war keeps its records, clean, cold, indifferent. But we remembered the mess. We remembered the smell. And I remembered Rashid's smile as clearly as the moment he vanished. Search teams combed the area, nothing. They said maybe he'd been kidnapped, maybe killed. But I'd seen the footprints. They weren't the tracks of a captive. They were the calm steps of a man walking away from his sins. A month later, Intel picked up chatter, talk of a local man who sold an American convoy's route for cash. $200. That was it, the proof, the confession, the price tag of trust. I remember sitting alone in the mess hall, hands trembling over a cup of instant coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Morales limped in, his arm still bandaged. He looked at me for a long time before sitting down. Can't stop thinking about it either, huh? I shook my head. He stared at the tabletop. You think he was always like that, or did something change him? I wanted to say something righteous, something like a man's choices define him. But I couldn't. Because deep down I knew this place, this war, had a way of changing everyone. Rashid used to talk about his mother, about how she was sick, about needing money for medicine. Was that true? Maybe. But maybe it was just part of the story he sold us before selling us out. I'd replay every memory, every joke, every gesture, every shared cigarette. Trying to find the crack. Trying to spot the moment the man turned into the lie. You tell yourself you notice it next time. But the truth is you wouldn't. Because betrayal doesn't shout, it whispers. Our unit was reassigned. We were ghosts moving through villages that didn't want to look at us. The laughter we used to share was gone. Even Morales stopped playing his guitar. Every interpreter who came after was met with silence. We nod, give orders, translate, but trust, that was dead. I caught myself avoiding eye contact with the new guy. He reminded me of Rashid, same accent, same quiet smile. And every time he opened his mouth, I half expected him to say something familiar, something that would reopen the wound. Sometimes at night, I'd wake up sweating, the echo of the blast still roaring in my ears. Other nights, I'd dream of Rashid sitting by the fire again, telling stories, laughing like nothing ever happened. And then I'd wake up furious, at him, at myself, at the war that made both of us who we were. One evening, I was called into the ops tent. Major Simmons stood over a table littered with satellite photo and scribbled notes. He didn't look up as he spoke. We got something, a rumor out of Sangin province. He tapped a sheet with his pen. Name came up, Rashid. My throat went dry. What about him? Word is he's alive, working with a militia group now. Not Taliban, some splinter cell that trades intel for cash. He looked at me then. Don't get ideas, Sergeant, it's not our mission. But I already had the idea. Not revenge, not exactly. I just wanted answers. For days I carried that name like a spark in my chest. I told myself I didn't care anymore. But every time I heard the word interpreter, I tasted dust and copper. A few weeks later, we were patrolling near Sangin. Different valley, same sky. That's when I saw him again. It was quick, like a trick of the light. A man in a long scarf, standing beside a truck on a ridge half a mile away. For a split second, I swear it was Rashid. Same stance, same way he shaded his eyes with one hand. I blinked and he was gone. Just the wind stirring sand. But that night, as I cleaned my rifle, I caught myself humming the tune he used to hum, the song his father taught him. And for the first time, I wondered if I'd imagined all of it. The betrayal, the ambush, the footprints. Grief can do that to you. It twists memory until you can't tell if you're haunted by ghosts or guilt. Months passed. The war dragged on. People back home stopped asking what it was like. Because you can't explain it. Not really. How do you explain that the quiet is louder than the gunfire? When our deployment finally ended, we boarded the plane in silence. No cheers, no speeches, just the heavy sound of boots on metal. As the engines roared, I looked out over the desert, those endless dunes that had swallowed too many names. And I thought of Rashid. Somewhere out there, maybe still alive, maybe already buried by the same wind that once carried his laughter. I whispered something I'd never said before. I hope you find peace, brother, even if it's in the next life. The plane lifted, and the horizon fell away beneath us. But I knew it wasn't over. Because the war doesn't stay where you leave it. It follows you home, invisible and patient, waiting to remind you what it cost. Years later, when I finally slept without hearing explosions, that's when the news came, the headline that would end it all. But that's another chapter. Because before karma catches up, it always lets you forget, just long enough to believe you've escaped it. They say coming home is supposed to feel like waking up from a bad dream. But no one tells you that sometimes the dream follows you. It hides in the spaces between things, in the hum of streetlights, the whine of a passing siren, the crack of fireworks that make you flinch before you can stop yourself. When I stepped off that plane, I thought the war would stay behind, folded neatly between the sand and the silence. But the moment I smelled jet fuel and asphalt, I knew I'd carried it with me. The desert doesn't let go that easy. My mother cried when she saw me. My father clapped my shoulder and said I looked thinner but stronger. My little sister asked if I'd seen camels. I laughed. It felt strange, like my body had forgotten how. At night, I'd lie in bed and listen to the hum of the refrigerator, too steady, too calm. Out there, silence meant danger. Here, silence meant safety. But I couldn't tell the difference anymore. I'd wake up some nights drenched in sweat, certain I heard gunfire in the distance. Other nights, I'd dream of Rashid, not the traitor but the friend. He'd be sitting by the fire again, telling stories, his eyes bright with that same spark that once made the desert seem bearable. Then I'd wake up, and the room would be empty. I got a job, desk work, paper and screens, and the illusion of normalcy. People would thank me for my service in coffee shops, their voices full of polite guilt. They'd ask what it was like over there, expecting movie scenes, dust storms, heroism, clear villains. But the truth doesn't fit in small talk. How do you explain that the enemy sometimes shakes your hand before disappearing into the hills? Or that the man who betrayed you once saved your life? So I just smile, nod, and say, it was complicated. The war faded from the headlines. New wars replaced the old ones. America moved on, it always does. But I didn't. Every now and then, I'd find myself scrolling through old photos. The unit, the faces, the smiles we used to fake for the camera. And there he was. Rashid, standing beside me, hand on his hip, grin so wide you'd think he owned the sun. Sometimes I'd stare at that photo until the screen blurred, trying to remember that version of him before everything cracked. It was a Sunday. Cold quiet. I was sitting at the kitchen table, half listening to the news and half scrolling through emails when a headline caught my eye. Local man executed by insurgent group for double-crossing. It wasn't a headline that screamed for attention, just a filler story in a world tired of war. But the photo made my stomach drop. The grainy image showed a man kneeling on the ground, surrounded by masked gunmen. The caption named him Rashid N, age 32. Interpreter, former militia contact, accused of selling information to rival factions. The article said he'd been caught trading intel for cash, again. The same sin, different devils. This time there was no escape. I read it twice, then a third time. My coffee had gone cold. The reporter wrote it like a footnote to a forgotten war. But to me, it was the end of a story that had never stopped haunting me. $200. That's what it began with. $200 for the map that nearly killed us all. And now, years later, the debt had come due. I sat there for a long time, staring out the window. The world outside looked the same, kids on bicycles, neighbors walking dogs, the smell of morning rain. But inside, it felt like the air had shifted. You'd think I'd feel relief. Closure maybe. But what I felt was nothing. A hollow kind of quiet. The kind that settles after thunder. Because even though justice had finally caught up, it didn't feel like victory. There's no joy in seeing a ghost finally fade, only silence. I thought about what Morales used to say. Out there, karma's just another kind of bullet. It always finds its mark. Maybe he was right. Maybe the desert had finally balanced its books. But part of me wished I could have spoken to Rashid one last time. Not to forgive, I wasn't that holy. But to understand. What made him do it? Was it desperation, fear, greed? Or had he simply stopped believing in any side at all? I'll never know. And maybe that's the real punishment, not his but mine. That night, I poured myself a drink I didn't really want and sat on the porch, listening to the wind push through the trees. It reminded me of the desert again, that same endless sigh, like the land whispering secrets to itself. Somewhere between the stars and the quiet, I thought I heard Rashid's voice. Not words, just a sound, like that hum he used to make when he was nervous. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel anger. I just felt tired. Tired of carrying the past like a weapon. Tired of replaying ghosts that refused to rest. I whispered into the dark. I hope the wind carries you home, Rashid. And maybe it did. Because that night I dreamed of him again, standing on the ridge, smiling, the mountains behind him golden and alive. Then he turned and the wind took him, and he was gone. The next morning, I clipped the article and folded it into the back of my journal. Not as proof, not as closure, but as a reminder that in war every choice echoes. Every betrayal leaves a shadow. And sometimes the justice we crave isn't vengeance. It's the silence that finally lets us breathe. The desert keeps its promises. It doesn't rush. It doesn't forget. It just waits patient, eternal, merciless. And when it finally moves, it doesn't bargain. There are silences that never leave you. Some are soft, the kind you find in early mornings, when the world hasn't yet remembered to make noise. Others are heavy, like the silence that follows betrayal, or the one that lingers after forgiveness refuses to come. Mine lived somewhere between the two. Years had passed since Rashid's name last crossed anyone's lips. To the men who served with me, he'd become just another ghost in the long ledger of war, a name scratched into memory beside others who never came back, or worse, came back changed. But to me, he was still the echo in the room when everyone else went quiet. The question I could never quite answer. It was late one night when I found myself sitting on the porch, desert wind replaced by the whisper of city rain. I'd grown used to the rhythm of ordinary life, bills, coffee, the hum of traffic outside. But every now and then something would take me back. A smell, a headline, a song on the radio that carried the cadence of another land. That night it was thunder, low and distant, rolling through the sky like the sound of mortars in the distance. I closed my eyes. And suddenly I was there again, standing in that narrow pass, dust in my teeth, shouting for men I couldn't save. Rashid's voice echoing somewhere between memory and madness. Then came the image, the one that never faded. His footprints leading away. The human mind is a cruel cartographer. It never forgets the paths carved by pain. I'd read the news of his death years ago, but sometimes I doubted it was real. There was no photo clear enough to be certain, no confirmation beyond a small line in an international report. Maybe that was part of me refusing closure. Maybe it was guilt, the quiet kind that doesn't scream, but hums like static in the back of your skull. Because the truth is, I wasn't just angry at him. I was angry at myself for trusting, for needing to believe someone like Rashid could walk the tightrope between two worlds and not fall. And yet I understood him. Maybe that was the worst part. War doesn't offer clean choices. You learn to live with shades of gray, with half-truths, with the small betrayals you justify just to make it to the next sunrise. Maybe he didn't want to betray us. Maybe he just wanted to survive one more week, one more payment, one more promise that the world would make sense again. But karma, she's not a negotiator. She doesn't deal in good intentions. She only balances the scales. They say he was caught trying to double deal between two insurgent factions. He thought he could trade secrets both ways, play the hero in his own story. But the desert doesn't allow second chances. They found him somewhere outside Kundar, his body left beneath a ruined wall. No ceremony, no farewell. Just sand reclaiming what it once owned. Some men die once. Rashid had been dying a little every day since that ambush. I remember staring at that report for a long time, my hand tracing his name as though touching it might make him real again. But it wasn't sadness that settled in, it was understanding. And that understanding came with a strange peace. Because if the desert remembers everything, the laughter, the lies, the blood, then it also remembers justice. Not the kind written in reports or delivered by soldiers, but the quiet kind, whispered by wind across dunes that never stop shifting. Sometimes I dream of that wind. In those dreams, Rashid isn't running. He's standing beside me, smiling that easy smile, asking if America really has mountains like ours. And I tell him, yes, but ours don't keep score like yours do. He laughs like he always did, and then the sand takes him again. When I wake, the air is still. No thunder, no war, just the sound of rain. I think about how small $200 really is, how it could buy a meal, or a lie, or a moment of false safety, but never the one thing he truly wanted, to belong. You can't buy belonging, you can't buy forgiveness. You can only earn them. And he never had the time. Sometimes I whisper a prayer for him, not the kind we said before missions, but the quiet sort you say for lost souls who tried and failed to find their way home. Because in some twisted, fragile way, Rashid was part of ours. And maybe that's why I can't hate him anymore. The desert may have taken him, but it left me something in return, a truth I carry like a scar beneath my words. Every betrayal begins with trust, but not every trust was a mistake. Some people come into your life to save you, others to teach you. Rashid did both. So I tell his story not as a warning, not as revenge, but as remembrance. Because even after the guns fall silent and the flags are folded away, the desert still whispers the same thing it always has. The debt has been paid. And if you listen closely enough, beneath the wind, beneath the weight of memory, you can almost hear it sigh. Not in anger, not in vengeance, but in balance. The desert keeps its books balanced. It may take years, it may take blood, but it never forgets who owes what. And in that, I suppose, there's a strange kind of mercy.